This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Rabbi, so we have an amazing topic this evening. A few weeks ago in Shul, my 4-year-old went over to another kid. He said, he asked him, by the way, did you ever go to Egypt? You know? So I thought that was a pretty funny question. But we have an amazing comment over here from a very rare sefer. The name of the sefer is Kaftar V'Ferach. I want to thank Mr. Sal Orbach for helping me with the research. But after he helped me with the research, I got my hands on the sefer. So the sefer Kaftar V'Ferach was written by Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi. Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi was one of the Rishonim. He was a student of the Rosh. He passed away approximately in the year 1355. Okay, so this is the comment of a Rishon. And he's telling us about many lavin in the Torah that people overlook. People are really negligent regarding these lavin. And then he tells us an amazing thing. V'chein hadar be'eretz Mitzrayim. Likewise, someone who lives in the land of Egypt, sha'oiver shloisha lavin. They violate 3 lavin in the Torah. Okay, you hear that? If you live in the land of Egypt, be happy you live in America, because if you live in the land of Egypt, you're violating 3 lavin. Now this is unbelievable. Vishamati b'Mitzrayim. And I heard, says Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi, I heard in Egypt, Mipi harav Shmuel Zal, from the mouth of Rab Shmuel. Who's Rab Shmuel? Echad mimnei banav shel HaRambam, one of the grandsons of the Rambam. So I myself, when I was in Egypt, I heard from the grandson of the Rambam, listen to this, Shekish HaRambam hayachoisem shemai bi'igara shlucha, when the Rambam would sign his name in a letter, hayamesayim, he would end off the following salutation. He would end off with the following seal. In other words, how would the Rambam sign his name? Ha-koisev, he would say the writer. Ha-oiver b'chol yoim shloisha lavin. The one who violates 3 lavin every day. You know, different people have different signatures. Some people, they have very dramatic signatures. Some people have very artistic signatures. Some people may even sign their name with a little message. The Rambam signed his name, the one who writes, he would write like this. Moshe ben Maimon ha'oiver b'chol yoim gimel lavin. That's an amazing thing. The one who every day of his life is violating 3 prohibitions, obviously referring to the 3 prohibitions of living in the land of Egypt. So says Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi, when I heard this from the Rambam's grandson, I was really awestruck. It pained me to hear that Goinu Zeinu, that Adoinenu, the Rambam would sign his name, the one who violates 3 lavin every day. So I tried to console him a little. I tried to soften the blow. So I told Rabbeinu Shmuel, the grandson of the Rambam, you know what? Maybe the Rambam had no choice. He was a doctor. The king of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt, forced him into it. And I try to soften the blow. But this is the report. We have testimony here from a Rishon, Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi, a student of the Rosh, who says he was in Egypt and he heard from the grandson of the Rambam that the Rambam would sign his name, the individual who violates every day 3 lavin in the Torah, 3 prohibitions in the Torah. Now, what exactly are these 3 prohibitions? We have, of course, in this week's Parsha, take a look in number 2, Beshalach Yudalad Gimel, Yud Gimel, Vayomer Moshe al Ha'am, Moshe tells the people, Al Tirou, don't be afraid. Hisyatzavu, stand tall. And see the salvation of God that God is bringing for you today. That which you see the Egyptians today, never again. Never again. The Rambam, if he signed his name this way, apparently learns this is a lav in the Torah. Not just Moshe Rabbeinu is telling a story. By the way, you see those Egyptians? You'll never see them again because Egypt is done. No. Moshe is commanding the Jewish people, never again do you go back to the land of Egypt. And if you live in Egypt, you're over a lav. Likewise, there's a pasuk in Shoftim, in Parak Yurches, pasuk Tezayin. Rak lo yar beloy susim. Don't amass horses. Don't return to Egypt to increase your horse collection. Very important to know. I know you're thinking, in the garage you already have a whole collection. You want to go back there to add to the horse collection. Don't go back there. Don't add to your collection. You want horses? Go to Aqueduct, racetrack. Maybe you could buy some horses over there. But don't go back to Egypt. Why? Bashem Amar Lachem. God said to you, Loisoi Sifon, Lashuv, Baderach, Hazeh, Oid. God told you, never again. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't live in Egypt. And finally, the third time in the Kisavai, in the Teichacha, it says, V'hashivcha Hashem Mitzrayim, Ba'aniyos, God will return you to Egypt as punishment. Baderach asher amarti lecha, on the very same road that I told you, Loisoisif oid leroisa. Don't see it again. So there are 3 places in the Torah where the Torah seems to say, don't live in the land of Egypt. And if the Rambam signed his name, the individual who violates 3 lavin every day, the Rambam most certainly is referring to these 3 psukim. Beshalach, Shoftim, Kisavai. Now if you want to know what the Rambam really holds about living in Egypt, you have to look at the Rambam's halachas farm. You have to look in what? The Sefer HaMitzvos and the Yad HaChazaka. So take a look at number 5. The Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvos and Lo Yisaseh Memvav, the Rambam tells us the 46th mitzvah in the Torah is don't live in Egypt. Ever. Not just in the year 2448 when we made it out of there. In the year 5774 you can't live there either. Why? Kedei shelo nilmad kfi rasam, so that we don't learn their heresy, v'shelo nelech b'darchem hamagunim eitzal Torah, and we don't walk in their despicable ways. Now pay careful attention to the pasuk the Rambam quotes, because I'm going to ask you, is he quoting Beshalach, is he quoting Shoftim, or is he quoting Kisavai? Says the Rambam, V'u amru yisale lo yisoi sifon lashuv baderach hazeh oid. What does it say? Don't again return on that road. What pasuk is the Rambam quoting? Shoftim. For some reason, he omits Beshalach. He doesn't quote Beshalach, the first instance. He doesn't quote the pasuk in this week's Parsha. He quotes Shoftim. Says the Rambam, but you should know, this prohibition is repeated 3 times. There are 3 times in history the Jews returned to Egypt. 3 times the Jewish community in Egypt was destroyed. Says the Rambam, why did I not quote the first pasuk first? Why do I start with Shoftim? The Rambam tells us the following. If it would just say the pasuk in Beshalach, you know what I would think? Beshalach is not a lav in the Torah. Beshalach is a storyline. Moshe is saying, Jews, you see those Egyptians? They're over and done with. You'll never see them again. Had it just been for Shoftim, you would say, that pasuk is not a prohibition, it's not a lav, it's a story. Moshe is telling them, you should know, you're never going to see these guys again. They're going down into the Yam Suf, you'll never see them again. But after I have Shoftim, and after I have Kisavai, that reveals to us that the pasuk in this week's Parsha is an additional lav. So in total, there are 3 lavin in the Torah. Don't live in Egypt. Rabbi said the Rambam in the Yad HaChazaka, number 6. The Rambam tells us the following in Hilchos Malachim, Parak Hey, Halacha Zayin. Where can Jews live? Where could you live? The Rambam says you could live in Williamsburg, you could live in Muncie, you could live in Borough Park, in Flatbush, in Gibraltar, in the Netherlands, anywhere you want. There's only one place in the world you can't live. In Egypt. In Egypt. Don't live in Egypt. And then the Rambam goes on to say 3 times in the Torah tells us not to live there. Again, he quotes Shoftim first, Kisavai second, Beshalach third. So this, the Rambam, both in the Sefer HaMitzvos and in the Yad HaChazaka, makes note of the fact that how many times does the Torah say not to live in Egypt? 3 times. That would fit in very well with the report of Rav Ashturi HaParchi that the Rambam would sign his name, the one who violates how many lavin every day? 3 lavin a day. You with me? 3 lavin a day. Then the Rambam goes on to say, the Isser is not to visit there, the Isser is to settle there. Now normally if somebody violates a lav, what does Bezdin do to somebody who violates a lav? A guy puts on his shatnez suit, Right? He said, we tell him, that Armani suit that you're wearing, it's shanis. He says, I don't care. So what does the Bezdin do? We have 2 witnesses. We warn him, don't put it on. Go get a suit from some other place. So we take out the shanis. He doesn't take it off. We give him malchus. Why? Right? Someone who violates a lav, the Bezdin whips. What about someone who lives in Egypt? Is this a lav that Bezdin will give lashes for? Says the Rambam, no. Why not? Because to go there in the first place, there's no lav. Maybe I'm just going to visit. The lav is to stay. Staying is not an action. Staying is passive. And we only give malchus for a lav sheyesh by maisa. So when you come in the first instance, that's not an act. And staying and not leaving, that's a passive thing. Right? That's a passive thing. So therefore we don't give malchus for this lav. But bottom line is, the Rambam's telling us, both in the Sefer HaMitzvahs and in the Yad HaChazaka, a Jew can't speak Lashon Hara, a Jew can't eat treif, a Jew can't wear shatnez, and a Jew can't live in Egypt. So we have one question for the Rambam. Maimonides, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, Adoinenu Rav Moshe ben Maimon, how could you live in Egypt? And he wasn't the only one. We have over here, number 7, a passage from a new sefer, a wondrous sefer. It's called Oitzer Plois HaTorah. And he has a whole long list of Gedolei Yisrael, all-time great Gedolei Yisrael, that lived not in New York City, not in Kew Garden Hills, not in Flatbush, not in Borough Park, not even in Gibraltar. They lived in Egypt. Who are they? Besides the Rambam, the son of the Rambam, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, he lived in Egypt. Rav Sadia Goin, Rabbeinu Betzalel Ashkenazi, the Shita Mekubetzes. The Arizal, he was an Orthodox Jew, right? He lived in Egypt. The Radvaz, you know who the Radvaz was? Rav David ben Zimra, the Rebbe of the Arizal. He wrote over 2,500 tshuvas. He was the chief rabbi of Cairo for more than 40 years. How could he live there? The Maram al-Shakar, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Rabbi Yitzchak al-Shakar, 1470 to 1546. Rabbi Avram Alevi, the Ginas Radim, Rabbi Yaakov Kashtero, Rav David Conforto, Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi. And like Erez is pointing out, Chacham Rabbeinu Avadia Yosef lived in Egypt. How did all of these Chachamim, Rabbanim, Gedolei Yisrael violate the 46th law in the Torah? You know what the first answer to the question is? Says Rabbeinu Ashturei Aparchi. That is exactly why the Rambam would sign his name, the individual who violates 3 lavin every day. How did he do it? He's telling us it was an Aveira. Now, to say the Rambam did an Aveira, we can't say that. Right? Mi pivanu chayin. We live by every word of the Rambam. We live by his statements. So how do we explain what we were going to endeavor to explain is, and this is a very practical question. I know you're thinking real estate here in the neighborhood is very expensive. A 2-bedroom apartment could run you, almost $2,000. And you see an ad in the newspaper, in Egypt today, you could get an 8-bedroom home with 10 acres of land for, $200,000. Maybe we have something going here. So this is not just, theoretical question. This is, halacha l'maisa. Are you allowed to live in the land of Egypt? Okay. So the first explanation we're going to give is from Rabbeinu Bechai. Rabbeinu Bechai in Parsha Shoftim, he tells us the following. An amazing thing. We had last week from the Sefer HaIkrim that he believes some mitzvahs in the Torah were only temporary mitzvahs. Like we learned, right? The Sefer HaIkrim said the mitzvah of using the Jewish calendar was only temporary. Says Rabbeinu Bechai, the sin of living in Egypt was a temporary mitzvah. Wow. It's zu mitzvah l'shah. It was a temporary mitzvah so that the Jewish people don't learn from their bad ways. Biku. So you'll say, what's the difference between the Egyptians and the Italians and the French? The French are tzaddikim compared to the Egyptians. Says Rabbeinu Bechai, the Mitzrim were well known to be involved in every form of abomination. Like the Pasuk says, Kemasei Eretz Mitzrayim lo tasu. And therefore the Torah warns us. But it's not a all-time, everlasting, eternal command. It's a temporary command for that generation alone. Says Rabbeinu Bechai, how do I know that? You know how I know that? Because throughout history, there have been so many Jewish communities that have taken residence in Egypt. And if it was an eternal prohibition not to live in Egypt, you don't think any of these Rabbanim would have spoken out, issued a kol koreh, Marav Rabboisai. There's something wrong with where you're living. Nowadays, you do the slide, right? Our Gedolei Yisrael are on guard. The slightest thing that we deviate, they let us know. They tell us, Baruch Hashem. Like Alman Li Yisrael, we have Gedolei Yisrael, they tell us if we're deviating, they let us know. So you don't think that the Gedolei Yisrael would have gotten up in the Shabbos Shuvah Drasha, Shabbos Hagol Yosha, they could get up and say, my Rabbi said, your tefillah is wonderful, your Torah is wonderful, the chesed, just one problem. Get out of here. You can't live in Egypt. Why didn't they tell them to leave? You know what the answer is? Because it's a temporary prohibition. It was only issued for the generation that left Mitzrayim because those Egyptians were particularly rotten people. But the Egyptians today, they're wonderful. They're much better. They have the brotherhood taking care of them to make sure they go in the right derech. But what? What? It says ad olam, never again. That's an interesting point. And if you want to learn about that point, you could see the Sefer HaIkrim that we learned last week, I believe in Chela Gimel, Perek Tezayin. He addresses what does olam mean in the Torah. But it's a very good point. But nevertheless, that's what Rabbeinu Bechai says. There's a slight problem with Rabbeinu Bechai. Number one, does the Rambam agree? So maybe you'll say it like this. You know why the Rambam lived in Egypt? Because it was only a temporary prohibition. It wasn't an eternal prohibition.
Why did he write the Rambam?
But the Rambam just says one little thing. Look at number 5 again. The Hamitzah Hamemvav, He Sheheziranu Mishkoin Be'eretz Mitzrayim Le'olam, forever. So don't tell me that the Rambam lived in Egypt because he holds like Rabbeinu Bechai. No. The Rambam makes it clear that he believes that these 3 prohibitions are eternal prohibitions. Secondly, there's a Gemara Masechta Sukkah. The Gemara in Sukkah and Aleph on the base says like this: if you never saw the governing body, the Sanhedrin in Alexandria, you never saw Jewish pride in your life. The building was majestic. It fit 1.2 million Jews, double the amount of Jews that left Mitzrayim. It had 2 rows of benches. Every chair of the 71 members of the Sanhedrin was made out of 21 myriads of kikare zahav. A kikar is 6,000 zuz. So 21 myriads of kikar. We're talking about each chair of the 71 chairs was millions of dollars worth, right? You could make a lot of money with those chairs, right, David? So
I'm going to Egypt to find it.
Yeah. So, well, babe, you got to hear the rest of the shir if you could go. But, and says the Gemara, the shul was so big that the chazan would sit in the middle, and nobody could hear whether he finished the bracha or not. So he would wave a flag. He would wave a flag to let people know the bracha was over, to say amen. And the Gemara says how, the weavers sat together and the goldsmiths sat together, and every profession had their own section in the shul. The usher would say, "Nu, what do you do for a living?" They had 10 pizza guys in one corner. And then the Gemara says like this: and they were all murdered by Alexandrus Mokdan. They were all murdered by Alexander. By the way, the Abar Benel in his Hakdama to Malachim says the Gersa cannot be Alexander Mokdam, because Alexander Mokdam was much earlier than this incident. After all, if the name of the city is Alexandria, it was named after him, so he must have been much earlier. So the Marav Ranchberg quotes Abar Benel that the Gersa should be just Alexander. It's referring to a different Alexander. But in any event, says the Gemara, Alexander wiped out the entire Jewish community of Alexandria. Ask the Gemara, what they do wrong? Answers the Gemara, because the Torah says you can't live in Egypt. And they lived in Egypt and they were all wiped out. Wait a second, I thought Rabbeinu Bechai says that living in Egypt was only a temporary prohibition for the generation that left Mitzrayim. And yet this Gemara is saying the entire community was wiped out because they lived in Egypt. Apparently the Gemara is not understanding this prohibition like Rabbeinu Bechai. This is a major question on Rabbeinu Bachai. Here the Gemara is saying that the community of Alexander, the community of Alexandria, was wiped out because they violated a prohibition. Rabbeinu Bachai says it was only temporary. Apparently the Rambam derived from this Gemara, it wasn't a temporary prohibition, it was an eternal prohibition. And therefore we're continuing on our journey. How did the Rambam and all these other Gedolei Yisrael, Rabbeinu Avram, Rav Sadia Gaon, Rav David Conforti, and so forth, how did they all live in Egypt? Okay, so now we come to another possibility. The Radvaz Rav David Ben Zimra wrote a commentary on the Rambam. And we mentioned earlier the Radvaz himself was the rabbi in Cairo for 40 years. And the Radvaz asked about 8 lines from the bottom. How did Rambam, how did Maimonides live in Egypt? You know how he lived in Egypt? He had no choice. He's running for his life. He makes his way to Egypt. The king finds out he's a good doctor, right? Even today, who do you think are the doctors in Eretz Yisrael of our cousins? The Jewish doctors. So you think it was different back then? So the Rambam, they found that he's a good doctor. The emperor, the ruler of Egypt, is not letting the Rambam leave Egypt. So you know how the Rambam could leave Egypt? He had no choice. Otherwise he'd be risking his life. Yes, it's a lav in the Torah to live in Egypt, but the Rambam was an oines, says the Radvaz, the Yeshloimar, the onos haya. He was forced, al pi hamalchus, shaya roifei l'melech v'hasarim. And says the Radvaz, what about me? I'm just a rabbi. I'm not rabbi doctor. I'm just rabbi. So what's my excuse? So he says like this. He says, "V'gamani nisyashavti sham zman meruba, lo my Torah lalamda." I went to Egypt to learn. There were good yeshivas there. There were good rabbeim there. And then I taught Torah in Egypt. And I established a yeshiva. And I also had no choice. The Rambam's life was on the line. And I had to learn Torah? What's the connection? The Rambam, he had no choice because the emperor was going to, off with his head if he leaves Egypt. And me, I had to go to yeshiva in Egypt. Yeah, but it's a lav in the Torah. So points out Rav Asher Weiss, in the Minchas Asher, that we see from the Radvaz, that he is expanding the concept of oines. He's expanding the concept of extenuating circumstance. The same way a life-threatening circumstance is considered an oines, an extenuating circumstance. If you need to be in a place to learn Torah, to teach Torah, Torah is also life. It's kihem chayenu v'arach yameinu, and you could stay there. That is the heter of the Radvaz. Okay? So far we have 3 explanations for the Rambam. Number 1, how did he live there? The way he says he lived there. He lived there in sin. That's what the Rambam writes. Number 2, Rabbeinu Bachai. Rabbeinu Bachai says it's only a temporary lav. Number 3, he had no choice. Number 4, take a look at number 12. 4th reason. The Hagois Maimonides, the student of the Marami Rotenberg, Rav Meir ben Rabbi Kusiel HaKoyen, says the Hagois Maimonides, 3 lines from the end. You know how the Rambam and you know how the Gedolei Yisrael were able to live in Egypt? Very simple. The Torah says the road you left Egypt, don't go back on that road. In other words, you're not allowed to go from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt. But from Borough Park to Egypt, that you could go. You want to go from Italy to Egypt? Gesund to hate. You want to go, you're an Eskimo, you're living in Alaska, and you get it, you have a cholam, you want to go to Egypt? No problem. It's the way you left Egypt to Eretz Yisrael, don't go back. So says the Hagois Maimonides, says the Sefer HaYureim, the Yureim was Reb Eliezer Mimitz, number 13 in Mitzvah Shin Gimel, that the only prohibition of living in Egypt is what? To go from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt. But you want to go from Coney Island to Egypt, no problem. Says Yureim, I'll prove it to you. Because there was a very, very great man who lived in Egypt. Even before the Rambam. You know what his name was? One of my favorite names. His name was Daniel. The Gemara in Masechta Sanhedrin Sadi Gimel and Aleph says the following. When Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown into the fire, there was someone who was conspicuously absent from that situation. What was his name? Daniel. It's in Sefer Daniel. The whole Sefer is about Daniel. And here Nebuchadnezzar is throwing Hanan, Mishael, Azariah into the fire, and Daniel is not there. Ask the Gemara, where's Daniel? He went to Egypt. What's he doing in Egypt? He's trying to do business with pigs. He needs pigs. So it's a good business, you know. You can make a lot of money when you deal in chazirim, you know. So ask Yirem, what's Daniel doing in Egypt? He can't live in Egypt. Daniel didn't come from Eretz Yisrael. He came from Bavel, from Iraq. You want to go from Iraq to Egypt? No problem. The only Isser is going from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt. Ask the Minchas Asher that if you look in the Shem Agdon L'Chida, does anybody know what country the Rambam came to Egypt from?
Spain.
Eretz Yisrael. Very good. Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the Chida says how he left the port of Yaffo. So don't tell me the Rambam was allowed to live in Egypt because he came from some other country. He's coming from Eretz Yisrael. So this would not be a good explanation for the Rambam.
It was an Einus though, no?
So that's a different answer. It's an oinus.
Oh, you're saying this one.
There's no
Okay.
oinus now.
Right? In other words, this is a no. You want to say, how'd the Rambam go? The Rambam was allowed to go because he wasn't coming from Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Now, you could say this explanation with a little twist, a very, very geschmack twist. And that is, if you look at number 15 in the Divrei Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Shal Halevi Natanzan, he writes the following. In Parshas Maseh, it talks about all the various trips Klal Yisrael made when they left Mitzrayim. They went from here to here, right? From Meirivla, the Sukkot, Zayachna Be'esam, etc. Fine. How many stops did they make? 42 stops. Mem Beis Masais, right? Like connect the dots from here to here, back this way, make a right, go 3 blocks, make a left. They made 42 stops. Do I care exactly where they went from here to there to here? Who cares? Just say they went from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael. Says Rabbi Yosef Shal Halevi Natanzan, an amazing chiddush. Since the Torah says, when can you return to Egypt? If you take the same path that the Jews took when they left Mitzrayim, you can't come back on that path. You know when you can't go back to Egypt? If you retrace the footsteps of the Jewish people backward. 42 steps from here to here and there to there and back and there. You know why I need to know exactly how the Jewish people left Mitzrayim? To know what road to avoid when you return to Mitzrayim. But let's say instead of taking that route to Mitzrayim, you go straight down King's Highway to Mitzrayim, then no problem. Then you're allowed to. Let's say you want to take the Hutchinson River Drive straight to Mitzrayim, then you could do that. As long as you don't retrace the Mem Beis Masais. That's the explanation. Now that might answer for the Rambam. Because the Rambam, how did he get to Egypt? Through the port of Yaffo. So the Rambam did not retrace his footsteps. And that would be a very big heter for anybody to live Egypt, because I would venture to say no one has any clue exactly how I'll ask you a question. It's very hard to understand this, because that would mean you would have to go through the Yam Suf and mimic Kriyas Yam Suf. You look in Tosfos and Erechon on Daf Tezvav. How was Kriyas Yam Suf? They went in and they went out on the same side. So how are you going to do that? You're going to hire a rowboat to take you exactly. It's not happening. So it almost makes the whole lav obsolete. Okay, but that is the explanation of the Shiur L'Meisher Rabbi Yosef Shal Halevi Natanzan. We have another answer. Okay, answer number 6. There was a very great man. His name was Sancheirav. Sancheirav had another name, Asnaper. Sancheirav had a whole world plan. Ba Sancheirav ubilbel kol ha'umay. Sancheirav mixed up all the nations of the world. He took the Italians, he put them in Japan. He took the Japanese, he put them in Manhattan. He took the Russians, he put them in Brighton Beach. Right? He took everybody and he mixed them up. So you know why you could go back to Mitzrayim today? Says the Smag. Because you know who's living in Mitzrayim? Who knows? You might have people from Nebraska. You might have, people from Brazil. You might have, Native Americans in Egypt today. Because Sancheirav came and he confused all of human population. Do you know what the halacha is? even though the Torah says you can't marry someone from Moav, you're allowed to marry someone from Moav today if they convert. Because we say they're not Moavi. They're from a different nation. Sancheirav mixed everyone up. You can marry someone from Moav, you can marry someone from Edom, you can marry someone from Ammon, because Sancheirav came and mixed up all the nations. So says the Smag, says the Uraim also, you know why you're allowed to go back to Egypt today? Because there are no Egyptians in Egypt. They're a different culture. It's a different ethnicity. Sancheirav came and mixed everybody up. That is what the Smag writes, that is what the Uraim write, and that is the answer of the Pri Chadash on the Rambam and the Sefer Mayim Chaim. Now there's a problem with this. You know what the problem is? Number one, this is not going to answer the Rambam. Because the Rambam writes that despite the fact that Sancheirav came and mixed up all the nations, he can't live in Egypt. So what are you going to say? You know why the Rambam lived in Egypt? Because the Rambam holds that Sancheirav came and mixed up all the nations and there are no more Egyptians in Egypt. Obviously not. Because the Rambam, writing well after there was a man by the name of Sancheirav, says you can't live in Egypt. Number two, you know why you can't say this answer? Like we learned in the Gemara in Sukkah. The Gemara in Sukkah says, why was the Jewish community in Alexandria wiped out? Because they lived in Egypt. What happened to Sancheirav, who came and put all the Native Americans in Egypt? I thought the Egyptians don't live in Egypt anymore. So you see from the Gemara in Sukkah that whoever is living in Egypt today, either they're native Egyptians or it doesn't matter. Because it's not the Egyptians we care about, it's you can't live in the country. And the third question, by the way, this question I just asked, that from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, this is the question of the Smag. The Smag challenges this idea from the Gemara in Sukkah. And finally, the Uraim points out, the Smag point out, that in fact, even though the Gemara in Kedushin says that Sancheirav mixed up all the nations, including Mitzrayim, we don't paskin like that Gemara. We paskin like Rabbi Yoshua, that even though Sancheirav came and mixed up all the nations, there's one nation that he ultimately allowed to return after 40 years, and that is the land of Egypt. The Navi tells us, this is the way we paskin, that Sancheirav mixed up every ethnicity, every culture in the world. Egypt was given 40 years. After 40 years, they're all back. So we paskin that if you go to Egypt today, those are meyuchastika Egyptians. Those are not stam people who live in Egypt. Those are people who their grandfathers were Egyptians, their great-grandfathers were Egyptians, their great-great-grandfathers, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, until just for a 40-year gap where Sancheirav kicked them out. So to say that the Rambam was able to live in Egypt because of Sancheirav, the Rambam clearly doesn't hold like that. We don't paskin like that. The Gemara brings down the opinion that the Egyptians were returned, and therefore this is also a difficult answer to give. Okay. Another possibility. Take a look at number 20. Take a look at number 20. The Shal Tshuva Shalom Eshev, back to the Shalom Eshev, Rav Shalom Halevi Natanzon, in Chelek Beis, in the fourth Chelek of Chelek Beis, Siman Kuf Zayin. And he says a very interesting chiddush, a very novel concept. You know who can't return to Egypt? A community cannot uproot themselves and move to Egypt. But an individual is allowed to go back to Egypt. Where does the Rav Natanzon get this from? Where does the Shalom Eshev get this from? So if you look in the Pasuk, look at number 3 in Parsha Shoftim. Rak lo yarbe lo susim v'lo yashiv es ha'am Mitzrayim. The people, the nation can return. But as a private citizen, you want to go back to Egypt? Gesundheit. You look in this week's Parsha. Vayomer Moshe el ha'am al tiro. The people, look, you don't go back. But as a private citizen, no problem. No problem. So the Rambam, of course, he didn't go with his whole shul. He didn't take the whole shiur to Egypt. He went by himself. He went by himself. According to Rav Natanzan, it's permitted. I would just humbly ask on this pshat that if you look in the Relic number 6, the Rambam in Melachim, Parakeh, Halacha Ches, the Rambam says like this. His hira, 2 lines from the end. HaTorah Ela Lashav La Yechidim. The Rambam says that if we conquer Mitzrayim, then we could annex it to Eretz Yisrael. What's the prohibition of living in Egypt? Yechidim, individuals. That would seem explicitly not like the Shoel Umeshiv. Because the Rambam is saying clearly, who can't return to Mitzrayim? Individuals can't return. Unless you say that all the Rambam means is as opposed to the king. If a community, of course he means a community. But as opposed to if the Melech is the one who conquers. Okay.
You can say also Hadrian was the Erev Rav,
Okay, right. But the Shalom Eshev is saying that this is referring to the nation as a whole is not allowed to return to Mitzrayim. Another explanation. Okay, we're up to explanation number 8. Okay, so you'll be able to sleep tonight. You were probably going to lose sleep. You're probably going to be tossing and turning. Oy vey, how did the Rambam live in Egypt? So instead of counting sheep tonight, you count how many heterim the Rambam may have had to be able to live in Egypt. Okay, we're up to heter number 8. And that is, says Radvaz, 4 lines from the end. This is in the Shalos of Shuvas Radvaz, Chilek Dalet, Siman Ayin Gimel. You know what we rely on that we live in Egypt? Even though the Torah says don't live there? Because we don't go to Egypt to settle there permanently. When a Yid goes to Egypt, he goes for a year or 2. We'll see how things go. We'll see how the real estate develops. We'll see how the job goes. I'll see if my wife likes it or not. We'll see if I have good schools for the family. I only go Lagur. Now, by the way, the Radvaz ended up staying for 40 years. But, says Radvaz, a Jew never goes anywhere permanently. We just go to Egypt temporarily until we're able to return to Artzeinu Akdosha, to Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, says Radvaz, because we don't settle there permanently, you're allowed to go there. Now, is this an answer for the Rambam? I would venture to say not, because if you look back at the Radvaz's commentary on the Rambam said clearly, Shaharei Nishtaka b'Mitzrayim. The Rambam did settle in Mitzrayim. Unless the answer is the Rambam settled there, but he didn't intend on settling there. Okay. Okay. And
because they were coming to Mitzrayim, but they were not going to, when they first settled in Egypt.
Okay. Right. The same way we came there. Rabbi say answer number 9. Says the Ritva, Masechta Yuma. If you're learning Daf Yomi, the Ritva is on Yuma Lamed Ches. He asked the question, how could the Rambam live in Egypt? And first he gives the answer of the Smag and the Pri Chadash, because Sancheirav mixed up all the nations. And then he gives the answer of Rabbi Lezer Mimitz. And then he gives a wondrous answer. He says like this. He says, when you can't live in Egypt? When we're in control of Eretz Yisrael. So to go from Eretz Yisrael, when have access, when you have not even to go from Eretz Yisrael, when you have the opportunity to live in Eretz Yisrael, and instead you go to Egypt, that's a lav. But if anyway we can't live in Eretz Yisrael, because we're in Galus, so what's the difference if you're living in New York or you're living in Egypt? It's the same tumah, a little bit more, a little bit less. If anyway you don't have access to Eretz Yisrael, says the Ritva, so what? It's better to live in France, in Italy, in Germany, than to live in Egypt? Of course not. It's all the same. It's all galus. So when there's a lav to live in Egypt, that is only when Eretz Yisrael is biyadenu, when you have the opportunity to live in Eretz Yisrael. By the way, it points out that Tzitz Eliezer, that it could be that today, that we do have access to live in Eretz Yisrael. According to the Ritva, the lav may be reinstated, and today you can't live in Egypt. So Rabbi Avadia was in a time where life in Eretz Yisrael was impossible. But now that it's possible, so says the Tzitz Eliezer, the lav may return. You can't live in Egypt today. Okay. Rabbi said, let's just address the following question. Many of these heterim we asked from the Gemara and Sukkah, right? One heter we gave from the Pri Chadash, from the Smag, from the Uraim, is that Sancheriv came in, mixed up all the nations. Yeah, but the Gemara and Sukkah and Alpha and Bay says Alexandria of Mitzrayim was wiped out because they lived in Egypt. What happened to the Bas Sancheriv of Bilba Kal Umais? What happened to the fact that they didn't go back on that route? What happened to all those heterim? So there's an amazing Marsha Masechta Sukkah and Alpha and Beis that perhaps would be able to answer this question. The Marsha says that in times of Yirmiyah warned the people, you better behave. And the people said, Yirmiyah, should we go to Egypt? And Yirmiyah says, let me ask Ribbon Shalom. And the Jewish people took an oath that whatever Yirmiyah tells them, they would abide by. And Yirmiyah says, don't go back to Egypt. Says the Marshal, you know why the Jewish people were punished so severely? Not because they lived in Egypt, because they did not keep their oath. So really, I'll tell you, maybe like Rabbeinu Bechaye, the prohibition of living in Egypt is temporary. Or maybe I'll tell you like the Pri Chadash, that Sancheriv came and mixed up all the nations, and today you can live in Egypt. So why were they punished so severely in the times of Alexandria and Mitzrayim? Not because they lived there, because they did not keep the oath that they made to Yirmiyah Hanavi, that they will not return to Egypt. Okay. And finally, the 10th heter. And this is a Kabbalistic heter. Okay? In case you were any Mekubalim over here in the Shiur, and 9 halachic heterim are not going to cut it for you, so you wanted to feel good even on a level of Kabbalah. So the Chida and the Dvash Lafi brings down from the Arizal, why are we not allowed to live in Egypt? The answer is, what's the purpose of Gullus? The purpose of Gullus is, you ever notice how the Jews could be in a country for hundreds of years, and then a moment comes, and we all leave, and we never return to that country. England, France, Spain, right? We're there for hundreds of years. Bam! The next day, not one Jew remains. How do we explain that? There's a concept that everywhere in the world, there are sparks of Kedusha that got dispersed. And the Jewish people go to various countries, they learn Torah, they do mitzvahs, they gather in all of these sparks of Kedusha. When we left Mitzrayim, and we left with the Milah and the Karban Pesach, we emptied out Mitzrayim so completely and so totally. It says, Vayinatzlu es Mitzrayim. We cleaned them out. In other words, there was not one spark of Kedusha left in Mitzrayim. And you know why we're now to go back to Mitzrayim? Because we have no business there. We wiped them clean. Now it's up to America. Now we just have to gather a few more sparks in America and we're done with. Right? Reb Chaim Elozner says America is the last stop before the Geula. But we did such a thorough job of getting rid of every spark of Kedusha from time. You're now to go back there. But says the Arizal, but the Jews went back there in the times of Yirmiyah. So guess what they left behind when they went back there? They deposited more sparks of Kedusha. Oh, once they went back and deposited more sparks of Kedusha, now we're allowed to go back to gather the remaining sparks. It's like, your mother gives you a job. Clean up the garage from every piece of dirt and get out of there, never go back in there again. I don't want to have to clean this up again. So what do? You clean it up, you vacuum it up. Then what happens? Your kid brother goes in, he gets the whole thing dirty. So now what? You have to listen to your mother and not ever go back into the garage? No, now you have to go back and clean it up again. So the Chidah brings out from the Arizal, the prohibition of living in Mitzrayim was for that generation because they wiped them clean. But now that people, the first generation went back, they violated the Yisr. But once they violated it, now we have to go back. Now we're allowed to go back. So far, Rabbi said tonight, we made your life a lot easier. We mentioned 10 heterim of how the Rambam was allowed to live in Egypt despite the fact, by the way, we're not finished yet, we're just starting. Despite the fact that there are 3 prohibitions in the Torah from living in Egypt, how could the Rambam go back? Number 1, the Rambam tells us he wasn't allowed to go back. The report of Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi is the Rambam signed his name. 3 Isurim every day. That's number 1. Number 2, Rabbeinu Bechaye says the Yisur of living in Egypt is what? Temporary. Number 3, the Radbaz says The Rambam lived in Egypt. Be'oines, he had no choice. Number 4, the Hagoyf Maimoni, the Smag, the Uraim. It's only also to return via Eretz Yisrael, not through another line. Rabbi Yosef Ashol Levi Natanzon says, what? Only if you take that exact route through the Membeis Masot. The Smag, the Pri Chadash, Sancheiriv came, mixed up all the nations. Egypt is no longer Egypt. Number 7. Says Rabbi Yosef Shal Levi Natan Zayin Shal Tzhuv Shalom Eshev. Only the community can't go back. Individuals are allowed to go back. Number 8. Says the Radvaz, you can't go there permanently. You want to rent? You could rent in Egypt. I'm giving you good real estate advice. You want to rent? It's cheaper than Kew Garden Hills. You could rent there. Number 9. Says the Ritva, it's only usher if you have access to Eretz Yisrael. But if you don't have access to Eretz Yisrael, what's the difference if you live in right? Or Egypt. And then finally, the Kabbalistic reason is once they violated and went back, so now we have unfinished business in Egypt. Okay. Rabbi say, now let me tell you something very interesting. It's reported over here in a very rare sefer. Again, I thank Mr. Sal Orbach for helping me get hold of this. There's a sefer, Divrei Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Sambari. Rabbi Yosef Sambari. Number 26. Rabbi Yosef Sambari reports to us, how did the Rambam get to Egypt? How did he end up in Egypt? Well, it always starts with the lulav and esrog. It was one Sukkot, and the Rambam decided he is going to fulfill Minhag Yerushalayim. So he walks out of the shul. He's holding his lulav and esrog like the Minhag is in Yerushalayim, holding it, not in the case, but like they do in Yerushalayim. He walked in the streets. Who does he see? The king of Spain, the king of Cordova. The king says, Rambam, etu Rambam. You've lost it? What are you doing? You're acting like a meshugana. He says, like a shaita. What is this custom? Says the Rambam, this is the custom that God, the creator of the universe, gave us. You're calling me meshugana. I'm not throwing rocks at anybody. I'm not killing anybody. So the king left him alone. The king goes back to his palace. He reports to the officials about what the Rambam did and how the Rambam's practice is very beautiful and how the Rambam said he's not throwing rocks at anybody. So the official said, do you know what the Rambam was doing by saying that? He was mocking your religion. He was referring to how the Arabs go and worship stones. So when the king heard this, he made an edict. The Rambam is a dead man. The Rambam found out about it, and he had to flee Eretz Yisrael in the year 4900 from creation. That is the story of how the Rambam made his way to Egypt. Let's go back to where we started from. The Sefer Kaftar Uparach, Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi reports that he spoke to the Rambam's grandson, and the Rambam's grandson reported to him that the Rambam signed his name, the individual who violates 3 lavin every day. You believe the story, or you don't believe the story? Now, Rabbeinu Ashturi HaParchi was a Rishon. It's a very credible source. He believed it. He's telling us he spoke to the Rambam's grandson. But Rav Ruven Margolis was a very interesting God of Israel. Rav Margolis lived in this century. He was a librarian in the Rambam library. But he wrote more than 50 svarim. People think, the Sefer Margolius Hayam must have been written 500 years ago. Margolius Hayam was written this century. Ruven Margolis. He was a librarian. He was a Baki Nifla. He also had the largest collection of Gedolim pictures in the world. He had a picture, every single picture of any Gadol b'Yisrael was owned by Rav Ruven Margolis. There's only one picture he didn't have. His own picture. Did not have one picture of himself. But he was known as a Baki Nifla. Baki Nifla. And he says he does not believe this report of Rav Ashturi HaParchi. Why not? Because says Rav Ruven Margolis, I have seen every single letter the Rambam ever wrote. Every tshuva and every personal letter that we have access to. Never did the Rambam ever sign his name, the one who violates 3 lavin every day. Number two, 3 lavin every day? Does the Rambam count living in Mitzrayim as 3 lavin? The Rambam counts it as 1 lav, mentioned in 3 places. So what would the Rambam be talking about? The one who violates 3 lavin in the Torah. It's only 1 avera mentioned in 3 places. And why in the world would the Rambam sign his name, the guy who violates 3 lavin every day? For what purpose? He's making himself to be bad. Is a lashon hara. I mean, it's Yadua Mefursim. Everybody knows the Rambam lived in Mitzrayim, right? But why would he do this? And therefore, says Rabbi Margolis, I believe that this story is not true. Yes, maybe Rabbi Shlomo Parchi met the Rambam's grandson, but the Rambam's grandson's report, says Rabbi Margolis, I don't believe. I don't accept. It's Eido Shabbat la Miktsasa, Bat la Kula. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, I also don't believe it. You know why I don't believe it? Why would the Rambam report to the world that he's violating 3 lavin? What is he trying to accomplish? What he's trying to say, look at me, everyone. I'm violating 3 lavin, and I wasn't struck by lightning, so why don't you come join me in Egypt? Well, what's the Rambam trying to do? Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, I do not believe the Rambam wrote this. Others say, no. Absolutely, the Rambam signs his name this way. You have over here, there's another, Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote Hagois on this Sefer Kafta Afech. There's another Gadol Yisrael, the Ratzach Ein Tov. He says, you know why the Rambam's telling the world about it? Because we know one of the processes of tshuva is that a person should never forget about his sins. So the Rambam never wanted to forget about the fact that he was living in sin in Egypt. That's how he signed his name. The Steichemet also says that if the Kafta of Aferach, a Rishon, Rabbi Shlomo Parchi writes that the Rambam said it, if a Rishon believed it, who are we to say that we don't believe it? And there's a great debate about whether this story is historically accurate or not. You look in the Pardes Yosef and Parshas Mishpatim, he says, no, story's not true. Story's not true. Tzitz Eliezer says, he believes the story is true. He believes the story is true. Look at number 31, Tzitz Eliezer and Chelik Yadalid, Simon Pei Zayin. Tzitz Eliezer says, let me tell you why the Rambam wrote this. An amazing thing. We're almost done. We're almost there. You know why the Rambam wrote this? Because says it Tzitz Eliezer, of all the 10 heterim that we mentioned tonight to be able to live in Egypt, you know what the most logical one is? That since we don't have access to Eretz Yisrael, if anyway you're living in Kew Garden Hills, what's the difference between Kew Garden Hills where you have the blue buildings over here, right? Or living in Egypt, it's the same exact thing, right? What's the difference? You have a little more, a little less, it's all the same. You're living with your cousins wherever you go, right? So, says the Ritva, the Isser of living in Egypt is only what? When you have access to Eretz Yisrael. Says it Tzitz Eliezer. The Rambam lived in a time where it was impossible to live in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore for him, it really wasn't usher to live in Egypt. But the Rambam does not want to write off that there's no such thing as an Isser to live in Egypt. The Rambam doesn't want to make believe that there's no prohibition in the Torah to live in Egypt, and therefore, even though in his times it was temporarily permitted because they didn't have access to Eretz Yisrael, nevertheless the Rambam wanted to eternalize, memorialize the fact that there does exist lavin in the Torah to live in Egypt, so that if someday we do have access to Eretz Yisrael, people will always remember, oh, you have access to Eretz Yisrael, now you can't live in Egypt anymore. So did the Rambam say this? Tzitz Eliezer says yes. Steichemet says yes. Reb Chaim Tov says yes. Rabbi Yaakov Emden says no. Reb Reuven Margolis says no. Now I'm going to add my 2 cents. Okay? I can't help myself. But one thing I know is that whenever we have a question about whether the Rambam said something or not, or did the Rambam do something or not, there's always the wild card that there was an impostor of the Rambam. There not only was one Rambam, there not only were 2 Rambams, there were 3 Rambams. There were 3 Rambams. In fact, you look in the Kesef Mishnah on the Rambam. The Rambam, right, by the way, right? What is the Ikar Tefillin? Ikar Tefillin is Rashi. There's something called Rabbeinu Tam. What type of tefillin does the Rambam say to put on? Rashi. Did the Rambam always wear Rashi tefillin? Oh no. The Rambam started off wearing Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. Says the Kesef Mishnah, you know why the Rambam started off wearing Rabbeinu Tam tefillin? Because there was a man in Cordova by the name of Moshe ben Maimon the Sefer. No relation to the Rambam. Who wrote a Sefer on Safras, and he wrote about the importance of Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, and he convinced all the Western countries to wear only Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, including all the Gedolei Adar, passing himself off as Moshe ben Maimon. You can look this up in the Kesef Mishnah. I saw recently that somebody told this to Rabbi Leib Steinman. He was so amazed by this, he wanted to see it inside. They showed him the Kesef Mishnah. He was blown away. He said, half of a fan. This is the Kesef Mishnah. The Maran Bet Yosef writes, the Rambam was fooled. Now, who says this? The Rambam himself writes in the Chuvas HaRambam, Siman Yotes, that there was a man by the name of Moshe ben Maimon who passed off that the Iker Tefillin was Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin until a rabbi, a Rav, came from the West. A Rav came from Eretz Yisrael. And they said they opened up the tefillin of Rav Hai Goin, and Rav Hai Goin had Rashi tefillin, and they all changed. They threw out the Rabbeinu Tam. That's the lashon of the Kesef Mishnah. They threw the Rabbeinu Tam, Hishlach tefillah, and they put on Rashi tefillin. So there is a man by the name of Moshe ben Maimon who wasn't the Rambam. Says the Chidah, number 35, that he read that in the city of Fez, the Yishmaelim wanted Lisroi Fes Harambam. Lisroi Fes Harambam. Scary words, right? Lisroi Fes Harambam. And what did the Rambam have to do? He had to make shvuos and use different shemois of Hashem. He used practical Kabbalah and he saved himself. Now, does this sound like the Rambam to you? The Rambam the rational Rambam who says there's no such thing as Shadim even, the Rambam never had the Sefer HaZayar. Does this sound like the Rambam to you? The Chidah continues. And then I heard testimony that this happened in the year Kuf Tzadik Ches, 1438. Was the Rambam alive in the year 1438? He was long gone. Says the Chidah, that's because this was a different Rambam. The Baal Hanisim was what we call the Rambam Mifez. But our Rambam is called Rambam HaSfardi. Says the Chidah, you're wondering that there are two Rambams? There are more than two Rambams. There are three Rambams. Because you have the Rambam, the Sofer, who convinced everyone to wear Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. So says the Chidah, when you're asking, did the Rambam say something and it doesn't fit into everything else the Rambam said, you know what the Chidah says the answer is? You know, in Brisk they say, Shnei Dinim. But now there's another way to answer the stira, right? There are two Rambams. No, but we know whatever was written in the Yad HaChazaka is the Rambam. Whatever was written in the Sefer HaMitzvah is the Rambam. But Rav Reuven Mago says, we never saw the Rambam sign his name, the person who violates 3 lavin a day. We don't know what Rambam that was. Okay, I'll let you think about that one. Tell you 2 Chsam Sofers and we'll call it a night. Says the Chsam Sofer in Parshas Sofer. The Yisur is to live in Mitzrayim. Are you allowed to visit Mitzrayim? You're allowed to visit Mitzrayim. Are you allowed to tour Mitzrayim? It's a mitzvah to tour Mitzrayim. So it's an Aveira to live there, it's a mitzvah to tour there. Why? Says the Chsam Sofer, tzaddikim make it their business to go visit Mitzrayim. Why? To be able to see the places where God brought miracles to the Jewish people, to see the place of Kriyas Yamsuf, and so forth. So people want to know, can I go back to Egypt for Pesach? That's the least of your worries if you're going to a hotel in Egypt for Pesach. The least of your worries is that you're going to Egypt. And finally, says the Chsam Sofer, this whole shiur is talking about before Mashiach. But Melech HaMashiach, we know, is going to conquer the area surrounding Eretz Yisrael, including Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim will be annexed to Eretz Yisrael, and then it will be a mitzvah not just to visit there, it will be a mitzvah to live there. We should be zoicha. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.